Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session 6 of the Troubling Anniversaries conference. Following Bo Jacobs' keynote lecture, we will continue our discussion on nuclear memories in this panel session. I'm Hiroki, based in Queen's University Belfast, chairing this session. Before we start, there are some housekeeping matters. Of course, closed captions for this session will be turned on, and you can find instruction in the chat box on how to turn it off. We encourage you to leave your camera switched on unless you don't want to appear on the video recording. So this session is being recorded and will be made available after the conference. Right, first of all, let me explain the rationale for this panel as an international comparison of nuclear memories. As a Japanese historian of energy, the first thing that came to my mind on learning the theme of this conference, Troubling Anniversaries, was the 10-year anniversary of the Fukushima nuclear meltdown. The memory of the nuclear disaster and its anniversary are undoubtedly troubling, but why are they so troubling? Is it because of the scale of the disaster, or because it was the first major nuclear accident in the 21st century? Or is there something inherently troubling about nuclear memories that is not specific to Japan? With that initial question in mind, I invited colleagues who investigate nuclear memories in different geographical regions to join this conversation with a view to exchanging ideas and exploring a shared research agenda. To begin, I've asked each speaker to briefly outline their research and their views on nuclear memories. We'll then move on to a panel discussion among the speakers and opening the conversation to the floor. To optimize the use of a limited time, I'd be grateful if audience members would drop their questions or suggested discussion topics in the chat box, which I hope to pick up during the Q&A. Now, let me introduce the speakers of this panel. Grace Holden of Birkbeck College, University of London, has written on the 3 Mile Island accident and its impact on American popular culture. Jonathan Hogg of the University of Liverpool has written extensively on nuclear culture, especially on the British case. Aglaé Indivicius of Kingston University, London, has been working on multiple research projects on nuclear heritage. And Anna Veronica Wendland of the Harder Institute has published on the politics of nuclear memory and memorialization in Russia and Ukraine. And fittingly, Anna Veronica is calling in from Grande in Germany, near the nuclear power plant, I believe. Can I invite speakers to give their brief talk in the order I just mentioned, starting with Grace, then John, Aglaé, and Anna Veronica, if that's okay. Right, so Grace, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you see the PowerPoint okay? Great, well, hello, and thank you very much for having me here today. My name is Grace Holden, and I'm a senior lecturer in modern and contemporary literature. I'm primarily interested in how popular culture, especially through storytelling, has responded to nuclear events and how cultural artifacts create and distort and engage with memory, as well as allowing witnesses to work through their experiences creatively. In my very short introduction here, I just want to say a few words very quickly on popular culture and how instrumental cultural artifacts are for exploring moments of trauma and the voices of individuals. Because cultural exchange is an excellent way not only to explore an event, but to work through a whole range of political, sociological, and psychological factors. Some cultural outpourings can be more useful than others. Some can be very educational. Some can be quite derivative, but they all form essentially a tapestry of how a contemporary culture may look back on certain events. And looking back as a cultural historian, it is interesting to take certain genres, so for example, cartoons and comics, at a particular period of time and think about how they respond to significant events such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on the slide here, I've got just a couple of examples of how comics in the period between 1945 and 1950 responded to the horror of the weapon, its astonishing power and mysticism, its intimidating spectacle, enormous potential, and how it essentially sent spectacle into overdrive, as well as presenting a lot of educational ways of leading the layperson through this this new technology that arrived very suddenly and catastrophically into public consciousness. And we ask, how do we respond to this seismic shift that nuclear power has had on our in our societies, and what material should we access to negotiate this, and how can we work our way through the facts of an event as well as the fiction that it inspires? So my focus in my last book anyway was on the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, in which the nuclear power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania experienced a partial meltdown. And in my work on 3 Mile Island, one thing that stood out to me that I think particularly relevant to this conference today was the release of the film The China Syndrome, which was also about a nuclear accident at an American power plant. And this film was showing at the same time the partial meltdown happened. And when I was approached to join this conference, I immediately remembered a quote that for me really underscores the entwined nature of fiction and event that can occur and the impact this has on how we remember events. And the quote is from Time magazine that was published several days after the partial meltdown, and they describe the accident as straight out of the China Syndrome. And this conflation of fiction and reality was quite common at that time. And in fact, a police officer who attended the scene of the partial meltdown, when interviewed, said he didn't need to go and see the film because he had lived through it. The reporting of 3 Mile Island and the coincidental release of the film, The China Syndrome, coincided in publications, which gave the impression that you could watch the film in the evening, but live through the actual event during the day. And of course, when you compare the film and the actual disaster, there really is very little in common. Nevertheless, 3 Mile Island saw fact and fiction become entwined in what I broadly call a nuclear narrative, which is quite nebulous and complex. And what I find interesting is how fiction is often a route through which trauma can be navigated. And in my research on 3 Mile Island, I found a lot of artistic outpouring after the disaster, which might not necessarily have been available to mainstream audiences, but was being quite regularly written right up until today. And this includes unpublished manuscripts and underground films in which personal stories as well as fantasy-based tales work through some of the dominant anxieties that came out of that event and resonate still, such as fears about the invisibility of radiation, anxiety that the government and industry misled the public, and concerns over contamination and so forth. So I'm not the only person who's noticed this this correlation. In Simulacra and Simulations, the philosopher Baudrillard wrote an essay on this convergence of the televisual and the 3 Mile Island incident that he called the China Syndrome. And Baudrillard's argument is that the fictional event has taken the reality of the crisis itself. And he argued that the China Syndrome is a great example of the supremacy of the televised event over the nuclear event, which itself remains improbable and in some sense imaginary. So he's not only suggesting that the film ended up dominating our understanding of the 3 Mile Island event proper, but that the accident itself became an illusion, in part because it was also part of a televised spectacle. So the 3 Mile Island incident, I feel, is more complicated than perhaps initially we might assume, and this is because of its connection to fiction. the 3 Mile Island accident was so often presented alongside the film that it was at risk constantly of becoming another story and of facts blurring with plots. And further, the feelings of mistrust and suspicion surrounding how the industry and the government responded to the partial meltdown led to questions surrounding the facts of the events itself. So even when facts were presented, there was a lot of mistrust surrounding that and whether that was just another type of spin. So 3 Mile Island, as I imagine most of you know, is famous for being the worst commercial industry accident in America so far. But it's also famous didn't happen, a full meltdown didn't happen. Likewise, in the China syndrome, the nuclear disaster didn't fully occur. Boja reflects on this also when he speaks of the human drama taking the precedence in the film. And both the China syndrome film and the 3 Mile Island disaster created an anticipation for an even greater disaster, which unfortunately would be realised with Chernobyl a few years later. But as a result, the 3 Mile Island event at the time was also surrounded by a lot of what if narratives that were also informed by cultural understandings of the historical events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So a lot of the narratives asked, what if there was an explosion? What if there was a full meltdown? What if there was fallout? What if it went to the White House? What if it killed the president? And these anxieties and these imaginations really out of control. So for me, 3 Mile Island is very fascinating because while an accident occurred, it was actually quite difficult to observe. When you look at footage from that period, it's just a picture of a power plant that wasn't operating. And as a result, because it was actually quite difficult to observe the accident itself, reactions to the event were quite tricky to navigate and very much informed by fiction and fantasy that was surrounding that at the same time. So thinking back to the focus of this panel, when I reflect on what nuclear memories can mean, I think not necessarily of testimony and factual recollection, which is of critical importance, but also of how the event has been narrated and in what ways storytelling and fantasy engage with the events. And for some, this might be interpreted as a muddying of recollection, as a distortion, or even as a disservice. But storytelling, as wild and as variable as it can be, is an important way in which people can connect to an event and can work through the traumas associated and voice their ideas and anxieties. And so fiction does become a part of that memory and a part of how people then and now can interpret an historical moment. Thank you. I think I'm bang on 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Perfect. And the crossover between nuclear memory and popular culture is a kind of continuing to be a major theme in research, especially perhaps after the HBO film series on Chernobyl. And it's also concerned with how we study nuclear memories. Perhaps we should come back to that in the discussion. The next speaker is John. Could you start, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Bo and Maurizio for the great keynote before as well. Thanks very much for the invite here and to be part of this conference. It's a little bit intimidating to be asked to talk about nuclear memory because it's such a huge subject. I haven't introduced myself. So I'm Jonathan Hogg. I work at the University of Liverpool and I wrote British Nuclear Culture, Official and Unofficial Narratives in the Long 20th Century. I wrote that 2016, well, it was published in 2016. And I've since worked on books that look at Cold War cities, socio-technical imaginaries of civil defence. Currently working on a project looking at Orkney protest culture when it seemed like a uranium mine was going to end up in Orkney. So geographically speaking then, I think as we saw in Bo's talk, the nuclear age was and is located globally. The technologies of nuclear mobilization, so whether it's weapons, reactors, uranium extraction or reprocessing, radioactive waste disposal, medical applications, are an integral part of 21st century life in many, if not all, nation states, and are often placed in marginalized or peripheral regions. The impact of nuclear technologies is ongoing and transnational. So where are nuclear memories situated, and how does local, national and global context help us understand the politics of memory? From the perspective of British social history, which is where I'm sort of mainly coming from and where I'll concentrate for the next few minutes, there's the question then of which groups of people we're retrieving memories from. So we have politicians, decision makers, scientists, engineers, and traditionally histories were written from these perspectives, and many museum exhibitions echo this, still echo this. There's an old regional seat of government down near Chester called Hat Green, and there's a big collection of nuclear weapons, old nuclear weapons there, and it's kind of proudly exhibited as such. So I think Bo touched on this in his talk as well, how museums still do kind of rise, they privilege the object perhaps sometimes over people. And I think this comes from that older strain of historiography relating to nuclear history. Matthew Grant has recently conducted oral histories with civil defence volunteers from the 1950s, and has made some really interesting conclusions about how civil defence volunteers thought about their time as civil defence workers, arguing that what happened in the 1980s, this huge critique of civil defence, actually shaped how people in the present responded to their work in the 1950s. Of course, we have a large group of anti-nuclear activists, including an increasing number of single-issue groups in the 1970s, 1980s. And all these people have their lives shaped for years by nuclear mobilizations, whether it's the people at the top making decisions or anti-nuclear activists. The nuclear age is really influencing the course of people's lives. So how do we historicize their memories and their roles? There's a lot of new social and cultural history by people like Jessica Douthwaite, Emily Gibbs, Harry Roberts, and also Claire Langhammer, that were very interested in how we might write histories of everyday life, emotions, and popular culture in relation to the bomb. Matthew Grant points out in his piece that away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and just as John Wiener put it when writing about the United States, whereas most historians' work on memory deals with the past people can't forget, work on the Cold War deals with the past people seem to have trouble remembering. So away from the big events, I think it's also worth asking how we retrieve the kind of everydayness of Cold War life. So just, I'll sort of try not to talk for too long, but just a couple of examples. When I try to sort of broach this subject with my students, I really like to use Carol Gallagher's work, American Ground Zero. So based in the American context, this book was first published in 1993, and Carol Gallagher is a photographer, and she went around collecting a series of photographs of American citizens who were affected by radioactive fallout from atomic testing from the Nevada proving grounds. And although accompanied by interviews, the images speak for themselves. We see scarring, wounding, and are told of the various physical and psychological effects of illnesses that stemmed from fallout. Brian Taylor interpreted Gallagher's work as an important counter-narrative to the official government line. The official line being that nuclear testing was first and foremost a national virtue, a way to ensure peace in the world, a valuable act to ensure nuclear deterrence and to keep the Soviet Union at bay. But through Gallagher's photographs, we see what Taylor calls the nuclear subjectivity of individuals. And recently, Jesse Boylan of the Atomic Photographers Guild has continued this type of work, trying to make sense of, as he says, this culturally invisible, damnably everlasting bomb of ours to make the invisible visible. So along with people, scholars such as Bo Jacobs, who we heard from before, Gabrielle Hecht has written masterful work on the politics of the uranium trade, again highlighting how the nuclear powers were able to procure, extract and use uranium almost at will, often exploiting colonial links. So we see this very strongly in the British case. So she, along with other scholars, identify this nuclear colonialism. I think that's an important sort of frame we might use to think about nuclear memories. In British society, collective recognition of nuclear colonialism or remembrance of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is at best muted and at worst non-existent. And in recent times, in a more local context, it's become clear that certain interpretations of nuclear history can be an affront to popular or collective memories of the past. A few years ago, I attended a very tiny gathering of Merseyside C&D members who had organised August the 6th Hiroshima commemoration in the city. Commemoration was interrupted by a man who was just passing by, and he shouted patriotic slogans to the effect that this commemoration was un-British or unpatriotic. Alison Young's book, Femininity and Dissent, published in 1990, detailed the sustained efforts in British tabloid newspapers in the 1980s to label the Greenham Common women as deviant, dirty, fundamentally illegitimate. These reflexes with their roots in journalistic discourse do persist. So I think, as Grace was suggesting, I think the use of language is really important when we think about how ideas about nuclear technology, nuclear politics are constructed, and then that will affect how people recollect their time in the Cold War. And just as I come to the end of this brief talk, one striking recent example of how nuclear colonialism is, again, a direct affront to the cultural memory of British conduct abroad happened in July this year, when a proposed art installation by the artist Gabriella Hurst, titled An English Garden, was effectively censored and banned by local councillors. The modest work consisted of benches and a row of flower beds planted with atom bomb roses, which is a rare variety of rose developed in, I think, 1953. A plaque explained this and highlighted the assembly, a nearby site. The assembly of Britain's first atomic bomb, the devastation caused by its detonation on indigenous land in Australia. The plaque also stated that Britain continues to proliferate nuclear arms following the recent government decision to lift the 30-year ban on the development of new nuclear weapons. So by sort of acknowledging the fact that Britain has a nuclear history, that there is a sort of what we might call a nuclear colonialism that still has reverberations around the world, conservative councillors, politically conservative councillors, threatened to subject the artist to a national media campaign that would frame the work as a direct far left-wing attack on our history, our people, and our democratically elected government. So, you know, clearly nuclear history is still contested in ways that, you know, we can also think about in terms of the Smithsonian controversy in the 1990s as well, the way in which the Smithsonian were planning to exhibit the Enola Gay became an extremely political issue. So just to finish up, as Stephanie Fishel reminds us in her article, Remembering Nukes, Collective Memories and Countering State History, she says, memory suffuses at many levels: those who experienced it, those who caused it, those who desire to take lessons from it, and those who want its silence, those who want to forget. Fishel cites Robert J. Lifton, a psychologist who in the 1960s developed the theory of nuclear numbing, where fear of nuclear annihilation led to the repression and burying of that fear. So it's easier for us to turn the other way. Fishel argues that it's convenient for the nuclear state to forget as much as it remembers. So just lastly, I'm really interested how in the British context, I've clearly been focusing on a few examples from the British context. The cultural memory of the national past still relies centrally on the Second World War. I think it's an important thing to mention in any discussion of nuclear memory, you know, the work of people like Penny Summerfield, Lucy Noakes, Claire Langhammer, and others who've written about the sort of enduring power of the collective or popular memories of the Second World War, and how this really impacts on how people think about their own sort of idea of Britishness. So I think particular nuclear memories or nuclear histories, sometimes nuclear realities, are just simply too difficult to place alongside these more palatable cultural histories or cultural myths, however you'd like to describe them. So I think there's a sort of uneasiness about nuclear issues. And just lastly, of course, you know, British involvement in the atomic bomb project that became the Manhattan Project and eventually, of course, contributed to the attacks, as Bo said, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This very, very rarely is included in that cultural memory of the Second World War, which again, I think shows how, yeah, these are troubling memories, I think, both politically and publicly. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much for delineating the contours of the nuclear memory studies, its richness and its ongoing nature. Actually, recently I was talking to the Smithsonian curator, and he told me that the Enola Gay exhibition was a kind of defining moment in the museum's history of how they interpret history. So maybe there's some sort of a spillover from how we approach nuclear history to other fields of technological history or other forms of memories. But we'll move on to Agle. You are the next. May I ask you to begin your talk, please?
Thank you very much, Hiroshi. Can you hear me okay? Right, let me share my slides. Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Egle Rundzevičiūtė. I'm a sociologist. I'm based at Kingston University, London, where I'm also directing 2 projects exploring the making of nuclear cultural heritage internationally. And I would like to thank to the organizers of this excellent conference, and particularly Hiroki Shin for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So what I will do, I will continue actually where Jonathan has just finished. So usefully about nuclear colonialism and its international dimension. And I will talk more specifically about the memories of Soviet nuclear colonialism, mainly looking into internal colonialism. So I will speak about perhaps somewhat less known agents of the memory of the Soviet Gulag and Stalinist repressions among Russian nuclear scientists and engineers. And I will consider the ways in which they merge the memories of the difficult Soviet past and the memories of the Soviet atomic project. And these people, of course, I will just touch upon a few examples, because the field is vast. There are so many different memoirs, books being published in Russia now. So many institutions, national and local and regional and private individuals as well, collect material culture of nuclear science and technology. There is some care emerging around historic sites and also presenting this nuclear cultural heritage to the public. And there is really a huge kind of tension between official narratives and counter-narratives of Russian nuclear past. So just a few examples of what is out there, what is being done. These would be the examples of official narratives of the Russian nuclear history. These tend to be objects, facilities, or museums which mark or celebrate inventions in nuclear science and technology, particularly the first, so to speak. So would these be the first reactors, the first nuclear icebreaker, the first bomb, and so on and so forth. Bomb is actually really important, and it might come as somewhat counterintuitive, but the Soviet nuclear bomb program became part of heritage discourse in Russia only following the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet period, during the Cold War, in the museum presentations at that time, bomb was written out, only peaceful atom was celebrated. However, the end of the Cold War, and particularly marking the visit of Boris Yeltsin in Arzamasarov, the place of the birth of the Soviet atomic bomb, nuclear bomb started to occupy center place in the narrative in the Soviet nuclear history. And there are now several museums where this bomb is proudly displayed and the history is recounted. So Another question is where is it located, this Russian nuclear cultural heritage? And this is a very useful map that can give you some idea where to look for it. And as you can see, it's everywhere. So these would be sites which are connected to uranium mining, to uranium processing, nuclear design, nuclear power plants, research laboratories, and so on and so forth. What is really striking is that this map is actually overlapping to a large extent with a map of Gulag. And the question really is how to combine these two stories. And this is something that I'm working on right now, but that's something that interests me a lot. So the very idea that the Soviet nuclear program was based on forced labor, and it was also spread in a colonial way, extending to Central Asia, to Kazakhstan, through nuclear test sites, but also to Uzbekistan through uranium mining, as well as Germany and Czech Republic, especially in its early stage, to Erzgebirge Krushno Hory region. So in all those locations, hundreds of thousands and thousands of workers of Gulag prisoners were mobilized to build nuclear facilities. So they worked in mines, they built structures for reactors, they built housing for nuclear scientists. So this history is being documented, but the question is it being showed, is it being remembered? And I argue that to some extent it is, but not directly. So encountering Gulag prisoners who are working on the early nuclear sites as part of a store of oral history, which is being collected from nuclear engineers and scientists, as in this example. This is where you can go to the Polytechnical Museum in Moscow and to listen to the stories of Russian nuclear scientists. And some of them spoke about deep concern and discomfort that they felt when seeing Gulag prisoners building the lab. Another evidence is very indirect. So any kind of museum exposition would have those archival images of a building of those facilities, and they would contain people, they would contain workers, but they are not named, they are not identified, they are mute. So we have this indirect evidence of forced labor in the construction of a Soviet nuclear complex. It shows, but it doesn't speak. So I will really finish here now, and the question is how to make this invisible part of this visible but mute part of the Soviet nuclear history speak in the contemporary museums. Whilst in the official narratives, what speaks loudest at the moment is technology, but not the people who actually built the whole Soviet nuclear complex. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, as John has already touched on some of those topics of marginalization of some sort of memories, perhaps we need to discuss this in the discuss this later. Yes, our final speaker is Anna Veronica. Could you start, please?
Yes, I first will share my presentation. So, do we just see, just a moment. Do you see it now? And do you see it switching? Just a moment. Doesn't. I just have the same problem that it doesn't switch. So I am here already on my screen. Ach so. An welchen Rand? Kannst du mal kurz gucken? I need some help because it is not my computer here. So I'm hier, das funktioniert jetzt. Jetzt funktioniert. Yep. Now it is okay?
Yeah.
It is a little bit, don't know why it is so slowly reacting. So, okay, my point is a little bit different from the speakers before, because in my research, I dealt with non-nuclear weapons powers with Germany and Ukraine. So making nuclear identities and memories is entirely, works entirely in another way than, for example, in Russia or in Britain, where nuclear patriotism is a part and parcel of this collective nuclear memory. And of course, as Egle already showed us, has its shadow sides, which are only recently discussed as forced labor. So my approach to this panel was, in a way, the questions Hiroki put us at the beginning. And that's just what I am doing here with you, discussing these fundamental questions which nuclear history and memory poses to us. Are there pitfalls in the way we are doing this nuclear history today? And I will give you a few examples from German nuclear history, which could be the pitfall we can address. And Hiroki asked us how we could approach these problems and how could we study nuclear history and memory cultures in order to tackle these shortcomings or these problems. So this is the two questions I would shortly discuss with you after, and afterwards we can have a little bit more discussion about that, I think. So first question, what are the pitfalls? And you know, since I am doing comparative history in Germany and Ukraine, first, of course, I am confronted with the influence of national discourses on nuclear history. And in Germany, of course, we have very strong influences of these major actors in German nuclear history. Of course, the anti-nuclear movement, which is in a way mystifying or a myth maker in itself. It's now historicizing itself, and of course, it is forging a narrative that it's we who brought down nuclear power in Germany, because as you all know, we will be phasing out nuclear by 2022. So the nuclear station I am here sitting now has just 70 days of operation still to do, and then it will be shut down. So it is an outcome of the nuclear controversy in Germany. But of course, we have other self-concepts as well. For example, in the industry, we have this anti-narrative, you know, it is them who brought us down. It is the discourse, it's the narratives who brought us down, although we were never defeated in the fields of technology. So it is in a way, a specific German variant, the Dolchstoßlegende. You perhaps know it. This is the World War I German legend that we were never defeated on the battlefield, but it was the Homeland Revolution who defeated our soldiers. So in a way, it is now a narrative of the nuclear industry in Germany, that we were never defeated in the field of technology. And of course, they have very good arguments in favor, because it is really rather benchmark technology, which is now phased out here in Germany. We have to admit that. And of course, a main pitfall of nuclear memory, it is teleologic history. So in Germany, very often now, nuclear history is in a way written from the hint side. So from this outcome of nuclear phase out and how did it come? So it is not an open and history, it's a closed teleologic one. And I think this is a major pitfall for researching in it. And of course, organized perspectives are very strong in this narratives. It is of course how I already told you, these strong anti-nuclear movement, who's in a way a maker of nuclear history in Germany, but it is as well, of course, top-down perspectives as mirrored in official sources, governmental perspectives, which tend to rationalize their their decisions and not tend to discuss, for example, contingency, as Fukushima, which was in a way a U-turn which generated a U-turn in German nuclear policy. And so contingent events are very interesting in discussing nuclear history, but they are almost playing no role in nuclear myth making or narrative making. So this I consider as a major problem. So what we could do, and now I will only very shortly to give you a small insight in what I did in my approach to nuclear history, because I tackled the problem from the side of methodology, and I started with asking the nuclear subalterns in a way, so the nuclear worker and the history of the nuclear workplace and the history of making nuclear safety right at the interface of nuclear machinery and people who are doing this in a way, as Gabrielle Hecht put it, the people working the reactor. So this was my subject of research. And the interesting thing is that we really, although we here in Germany, we are living in a country full of labor history. If you, for example, consider the coal mining industry, we have great records of labor history. And it is astonishing and really interesting that we have almost zero labor history on this nuclear industry, which is now without any discussion and without any even ritual is now phased out. We have nothing in a way. We have no organized memory making in this industry. It is simply slowly and silently going, and no one is really dealing with this world of industrial culture and in this labor world. So this is precisely the point I addressed when turning my attention to the material history. So the interesting thing, which is linking up my research, for example, with Grace's, is that I did, for example, microhistory on technical systems and how they are produced as safety repertoires in the nuclear industry. And I actually researched on pressurizer relief valves, which were indeed the root cause of the accident at 3 Mile Island. So, and I researched all these procedures as in making these systems and safer after this experience of 3 Mile Island. So I turned attention to the very materiality of this problem. And so I try to approach it by case study based microhistorical approaches. I did comparative analysis, and I did it in a way with Bruno Latour's approach of machine ethnology. So I went into this alien culture as an ethnographer in a way. So this is the work I'm doing at the radiation controlled area in a way, and it is looking like that. So the photo you see here on the bottom, that is Gronde, where I'm just sitting with another field study. This was in Ukraine, in Rivne. So it is the side of the nuclear industry in the Soviet Union, which is anyway, which is in a way normalized. You know, it's not the accident history, it's not the Chernobyl thing, but it's the other thing in Ukraine. You know, you have in a way, a success story of the nuclear industry in Ukraine as well. And this was actually, I was researching into in the very landscape of Chernobyl in Polisia, where you have two other large nuclear power stations, and I did my field research in one of them. And this is the German side of it, where I really studied. I did very specialized studies on systems, and one of these were as well this everything around nuclear fuel. And what was very interesting for me is that whereas in the outside nuclear fuel is mystified, and all people are, you know, thinking about this magic blue light and this Cherenkov radiation thing and so on. If they are thinking about fuel, and of course they think about all these controversies about nuclear fuel transports and about final repositories. But no one never discussed how it is normalized in the very process of working with it. So I did research on this, on especially that, the working with nuclear fuel. And this is really understanding how there's this discrepancy between the normalized nuclear work in the inside of this containment, which regards the fuel in a way as an object to load, and the outside, which has large narratives organized around nuclear fuel. And what was very interesting for me and very central for me was, of course, the subaltern voice. So these people who were not the engineers who then went to the museums and coined the narratives on nuclear history, but especially these people who had their memories stored, for example, in digital archives. For example, very many people from Pripyat, simple nuclear workers, as this electrician who took this photo in Chernobyl, they left their memories in digital archives and on websites. And this is an excellent source to study the identity of the nuclear worker who never spoke up and never left memory books as the engineers did. And this is an example of these lists of people I interviewed. I worked with them. I had working situations with them, and I interviewed them during these working situations on historical manners, how to do the same work, how they did it 20 years ago. And so I so had a sample of approximately 200 persons, which I worked with, and that was always those, almost everyone was from this that lower range of the nuclear hierarchy. I had almost no leaders in my sample, so it was one of my field approaches. So the issues I unearthed in this research are very, very different and diverse. It is about how people are narrating about risk and fear, for example, in their profession. It is how they are tackling emotions, because emotions is a field which is very, very unlikely to be addressed by official narratives on the nuclear industry. It is about self-concepts. I found very much diverging and even self-concept conflicts between the senior staff and the simple nuclear worker. I had very interesting insights in gender and nuclear work. We could discuss that further. And at the very end, I compared how these nuclear people were reacting on Chernobyl and how they tackled this Chernobyl burden in Ukraine and in Germany. And this is, of course, a very interesting outcome as well. And we see in Germany, there's an industrial world almost forgotten. It is now going into non-being in a way. And we have this interesting discrepancy between a very, very well-researched nuclear controversy and a very decisive public disinterest in the nuclear memory as it is stored in the heads of the nuclear worker. And on the other side, we have Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine, where people went through the crisis of Chernobyl and tried to re-innovate a disaster experience, to learn from it, and then to create a resilience narrative out of it. That is what I noticed in Rivne, a nuclear power plant, where everything is, of course, centered around this learning the lessons of Chernobyl and never doing everything to have it never again happen. So, and this is, of course, though Ukrainian nuclear industry went through much more crises and problems as Germans did, the outcome is that the Ukrainian industry has a future and the German doesn't have. And of course, Chernobyl Fukushima play a crucial role in this thing. So I will finish here. It's only a short insight. I think we can discuss all these issues and problems in our common discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we only have 10 minutes or so, but I'm glad to see that the papers are already starting to talk to each other, like there's an overlap between Veronica's talk and Agles's talk. But I'd like to start with one fundamental question. It's a little bit odd to say, but what is nuclear memory? How do we conceptualize nuclear memory? The reason why I'm asking this question is that there seems to be a tendency that nuclear memories are often reduced to specific aspects of memory, such as Anna Veronica said, anti-nuclear memory, or technological development, or even the nuclear disasters. For instance, and we emphasizing too much of the disaster aspect of nuclear memory, kind of forgetting other aspects of nuclear memory. That's my question. Who wants to start? With Grace? You?
Sorry, did you want me to start? I think what is nuclear memory? I think it's interesting because if we think about it comes, for me, it comes down to who creates nuclear memories and how agency works and the layering of how a memory is developed over time as well. So, if we think about the layers of an event, we've got the witnesses to the event, the generations who learn from those witnesses, those who have studied the event. And then, of course, as I said in my very short talk, you've got the complication of misinformation and fiction, etc., becoming woven into that. So when I think about what nuclear memory is, I think my mind immediately goes to facts, but that's not the only way to look at it. And when we think about sort of cultural products that explore a whole range of responses to a nuclear event, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to ascertain where the nuclear center point is within that. Certain works might be described as responding to, like Chernobyl or Hiroshima, etc. But they can be so fantastical, it's difficult to negotiate how this is a response. But there's something in that about how memories can be, how they can be formed and how they can be presented that are quite, they're not necessarily straightforward. And I think that's the challenge, is finding a way to navigate through the different types of memories that arise.
That's right. Agle, you want to say something? Agle?
Yes, thank you very much. It's really such a good question. Thank you, Hiroshi. I was just quickly writing down the types of nuclear memories I could think of, particularly in relation to the field I know best, the Russian case. And I would say at least 4 types indeed. And I would like to start first with perhaps the least expected one, strategic nuclear memories. So for instance, one thing that I learned very quickly at Rosatom, the Russian atomic corporation, was that their interest in developing museums and heritage sites was in using those places to remind Putin's government officials that nuclear industry exists and that they have special needs. Oil and gas people, we don't seem to need to make those kinds of reminders because we earn money. Nuclear power is spender, we spend money. So we have to remind the government through the memory, through the history, that we have those very diverse needs. Another type of memory would be the one that comes bottom up from nuclear veterans that Anna Veronica was speaking so extensively, and it is historicizing. It's making sure that the experience, the material culture is transmitted to future generations. The other type of memories I could think of would be the critical ones. So those would be associated with anti-nuclear movements. And in Russia, with such places as Sakharov Archive and Museum detailing the activities of Andrei Sakharov. And last but not least, of course, nature is the biggest memory bearer of nuclear past. Anyway, we look at dendrochronological wood samples, soil samples, water samples, the isotopes will be there. So the whole nature could be regarded as a bearer of nuclear memory, as a giant archive, which is there to be read.
Right.
So that's all.
Okay, Anna, Veronica, did you? Yeah.
Yes, that, in a way, Egle already anticipated I think what I wanted to say as well. It's, of course, this Anthropocene thing that the very geological structure now is bearing the memory. And the task is how to decipher it in future generations, you know, how they will interpret. But for me, the interesting point is these conflicting memories. You know, Egle mentioned it. Russia is conceptualizing itself in a way as a hydrocarbon superpower, not as a, of course they have nuclear weapons, but what really makes the difference and the identity of the Russians is that they are exporting oil and gas, especially to the Germans, by the way. And so the superpower thing and where the money is earned, this is hydrocarbon, it's not nuclear. And nuclear is upcoming with many projects abroad, but anyway, I think it's really this interesting thing what Egle mentioned, that the Atomschicki want to bring themselves into remembrance because they are in a way afraid of being forgotten in this superpower narrative. This is a very interesting thing. The thing which I was confronted with constantly, it is this discrepancy between the history or the memory of the normalized atom, so this everyday history of this very often very profane industry, which is nothing more than this everyday experience, is very often very similar to other industries, with trade unions and sociability with shift work and so on. And on the other side, we have this extreme exceptionalization, all these myths, which are, of course, generated by the very way of securitizing nuclear power. You know, I cannot simply walk in to this nuclear power plant. I had to go through all these security checks and medical checks and testings and so on. And then only I got this card, which allows me to get into the radiation controlled area, you know? And this is precisely this thing that the industry made up a material world which gave the prerequisites for making the myth. And on the other side, the myth is the problem they have to tackle with, because they want to be normal, but they are memorized as exceptional. And this is very problematic for an industry which wants to be successful through normality. And so I think that this is the basic problem when asking what is done in a society with memory.
Okay, I saw John nodding to what Anna Veronica said. Do you want to add something?
To be honest, I think Grace covered most of the things I was going to say. You know, I'm also very interested in what Egle was saying about the function that memory could potentially take as well. So if we're thinking about sort of whether it's the way memory is utilized serving a function, or how cultural memory serves to shape people's understandings, people's perceptions of the nuclear past. So yeah, I think I was just overlapping with all three speakers really, so I don't have much else to add.
But I think what you just said kind of leads to the main theme of the conference. What's the role or meaning of anniversaries? What's the meaning of anniversaries in nuclear memorization? That's related, I think, to the issue of the function of memory. Don't you think?
Yeah, and I think we certainly saw that in Bo's talk, in how I suppose in different national contexts we have different commemoration, cultures. I suppose, and in the British context, as I said earlier, there seems to be little or no commemoration of nuclear history whatsoever. But we've seen in the American context how there's a very much more of a proud, certainly in the early post-war era, proud culture of atomic commemoration, atomic heritage, I think, as well. I mean, Egla's very much leading on a lot of these questions in terms of how we might think about nuclear heritage, and I think heritage, memory, very, very intertwined. So I'm not sure what else I can really say on that.
Mm. Yes, and I would say that my question also relates to this question in the chat box. I'll just read out. After the China Syndrome nuclear accidents, used the term 3 Mile Island became the shorthand for nuclear accident in nuclear history. Do the panel, which do the panel think the Chernobyl and Fukushima would be the kind of new word representing nuclear memory or nuclear history? Anna Veronica?
Yes, I would suggest that there will be a kind of divided memory, because in Eastern Europe, anyway, there's Chernobyl is the point. In Ukraine, of course, people are concerned about Chernobyl, and Fukushima was played almost no role in neither in the public discussion nor in the nuclear industry. Of course, internal practices and on nuclear safety were affected by Fukushima, but there was no Fukushima discourse. Whereas in the German case, Fukushima is really remembered much more than Chernobyl. It is simply the day when the end of the German nuclear industry began. It's due to Fukushima. They were ruined, so they remember the day as in a way, a day of mourning, I suppose. Because it was that what brought them down in a way. Though they had no reactor affected, but it brought them down, not the Japanese nuclear industry. It's the interesting thing.
Right. Anyone else? Okay. And yes. Just because we just touched on the Chernobyl and the Fukushima comparison and the kind of contemporary aspect of memorialization, I asked Bo Jacobs, but after Grace's talk, I mentioned the HBO series of Chernobyl, and I wonder what's the take on those experts on nuclear memory about these new media that kind of memory making. Does anyone have views on this kind of commercialization or?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think Christopher put a question in the chat there as well about nuclear memory revolving around things like threads, which is a really harrowing drama that was put on British TVs in 1984. Very harrowing, and actually a lot of people in oral history interviews. So I had two PhDs looking at kind of social history of nuclear anxiety. And a lot of people went straight to threads. That was one kind of anchor point that people seemed to go to even before Chernobyl. People remembered watching threads and remembering how scared they were. So yeah, it is interesting to think whether Chernobyl would have the same impact. I think back in the 80s, that sort of extreme, relentless depiction of what would happen after nuclear war was quite new. So it did have a pretty strong effect. So you might say now that HBO Chernobyl wouldn't quite have the same impact, but yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, I'm afraid our time has run out and we need to wrap up the session. But even though we had a very short time, but I believe we had an interesting discussion, and hopefully we can continue our dialogue in one way or another. Right, I would like to thank all the speakers and audience for their participation.